We're now on at 9 a.m., but you know that because you're watching. I'm Charlie Sykes. Sunday Insight starts right now. Good morning and welcome to Sunday Insight. In the week that was, another horrific school shooting in Oregon fires up the debate over guns again. Russia flexes its muscles by bombing Syrian rebel positions. And disappointing jobs numbers raise new questions about the economy. State legislators roll out plans to modernize the state's civil service law. A threat shuts down the Pewaukee schools on Friday. And a massive brawl erupts at Milwaukee's Barack Obama High School. Yeah, and that is a thing. But we start with the latest poll numbers. In the week after he dropped out of the presidential race, the Marquette Law poll shows Scott Walker's approval rating has dipped to 37%. That same poll also showed Donald Trump leading the Republican primary for president, but it also had some bad news for the Donald. His approval rating among state Republicans is just 37%, with a whopping 54% of state Republicans saying they view Trump unfavorably. That seems to suggest that he does not have much room to grow. Hillary Clinton leads among Democrats, but she has also lost ground to socialist Bernie Sanders and not yet announced Joe Biden. Joining me on our panel this morning, the Milwaukee Community Journal's Mikel Holt, former state representative Michelle Litjens, defense attorney Dan Adams, and Media Tracker's Brian Sikma. We'll start with you, Michelle. 37%, a lot of people going, ooh, boy, it was a very serious problem for Scott Walker. He's got a lot of rebuilding to do there.
He has a lot of work to do. I thought some of the other numbers were interesting. They said 61% of those who responded said that Scott Walker doesn't care about them. Right. I think the fact that he ran so quickly for president and looked like he was lining up to run for president right after he won re-election as governor, Wisconsin needs to feel the love from Scott Walker. So he has a lot of work to do in the state.
I mean, a couple of things, and I said this on the radio, a couple of these are just quibbles. The sample, as the pollster acknowledged, did skew a little bit to the Democrats, with oversampled Democrats, plus the timing of the poll. They went out into the field in just the days after that campaign crashed and burned. Probably not the most optimal moment for Scott Walker. 37%, what was your reaction?
Yeah, there's really no way to put a good spin on this for Scott Walker. I mean, some of the reasons I think people have gotten tired of him here are the same reasons people did nationally. I mean, it started with the ethanol flip-flop and the immigration kind of flip-flop-flip. And it's just not the same resolute, unintimidated, if you will, Scott Walker that I think a lot of Wisconsinites thought was him.
Break that down, Brian Sikma, because there's two things. You know, obviously, I think, some of that brand might have been tarnished by the presidential campaign, but he's also been an absentee governor. And when you are invisible and you're not making your case, you're not around the state, people don't see you, you're not defending your record, that obviously is going to, cost you some points. So how would you break down that 37%?
Well, 37% is a pretty good place for him to be at right now, and you consider he's probably going to go up from there. I mean, he's going to be able to get his momentum back. He's going to be able to begin talking about what Republicans did this past spring in the legislative session. Now we're in the fall legislative session. He's going to be able to tout those reforms. He's already been talking about embracing civil service reform, so that's going to be a chance for him to go out. What Republicans have been missing in Wisconsin is a governor, because he's been on the presidential campaign stage, and they've also been missing a spokesperson, because it's not really clear who's going to be the champion of these ideas. That's why in previous Marquette polls you saw kind of conservative reforms not getting a positive review.
Okay, but the other question is, when you're down that far, though, does that affect your ability to be able to lead? Will Republican legislators start distancing themselves from him as a result of that?
I think they might, because many of them think that he's a lame duck. And with these kind of ratings, it looks like he won't run again anyway. But if he's a lame duck, why invest in your time and energy? Scott Walker's always been a master of self-promotion as well. He touted himself as being this major reformer to the right. And he hasn't been able to do that in the last year effectively, because he's been on the campaign trail. So, all of these different, and I think a lot of people follow the leader. They saw his rankings drop in the presidential bid, and they said, oh, the world must know something we don't know, and they joined in.
Well, that's why I think the Scott Walker 2.0 is crucial, because, one of the questions is, does he have political juice? Is he out of ideas? What is he going to be pushing? Because I'm guessing that he hasn't given a lot of thought to that, because he had a different plan, and now he's got to retool completely completely. Let's talk about the presidential race. Donald Trump is leading, but he's at 20%, not an overwhelming margin. You know, and I cited the disapproval numbers. Has he topped out, or is that a pundit being wrong again about Donald Trump?
No, I mean, unfortunately, he's going to stick around for a while, but we haven't seen his numbers go up in the last couple polls that we've been seeing. So I think he has topped, and I think you were going to see, I mean, Marco Rubio is still climbing, Carly's still climbing, so I think that we are going to see him eventually fall out. His negatives are so high, he cannot grow.
I think you hope he's topped out.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, everybody here hopes that he's topped out. I think she's right, though. I think Rubio was going to start easing up. Jeb Bush was on the bottom, which was really kind of surprising.
Well, I mean, it is interesting. None of the other candidates in the race have particularly high negatives. I don't think anybody breaks into double digits, or maybe at 10%. He's at 54%, and that's among Republicans' disapproval rating. He's at 63% overall disapproval rating. So you have that weird dichotomy. You're number one because the race is so split up, but it would certainly suggest to me that there's not a lot of room for him to move up.
Well, yeah, he's got this pretty cement ceiling and floor. The interesting thing, if you look at Wisconsin's poll, the Marquette poll, Scott Walker's voters largely went to him, so that's kind of scary for Republicans.
Well, but that's because people are dissatisfied, I think, with what they see as establishment status quo, for better or for worse, and they view Donald Trump as that medium for expressing discontent. But look at the last two GOP presidential nominees. John McCain and Mitt Romney both outlasted their competition. Neither was really the first pick of the party, but they didn't have the sky-high negatives we're seeing Donald Trump have. And so while Trump has money to continue his campaign, he doesn't have those favorable, unfavorable
there was always one standard bearer to rally behind. Here, there's multiple.
Right, I think that the Donald Trump act gets old because everything gets old. We have short attention spans. The more he talks, I think the more tedious it gets. And that's why I do sense that there is that. I mean, I was telling somebody before the show here that I hear a lot of people, will say that, well, I like what Trump says. Now, I'm not supporting him. I'm not voting for him. I think that sounds like a candidate who is not going to have a long ability to be able to go through this. Again, you never underestimate the money, but I don't know. What is your glass half full? What is your glass half empty? Let's go around the table. We'll start with you, Mikel Holt.
Well, my glass is half full because after discovering one of their social workers was a convicted rapist, the state will now conduct background checks. My glass is half empty because the state is only going to do background searches on 5% of the 10,000 social workers.
Michelle Litjens.
My glass is half empty because Wisconsin will be losing hundreds of mining manufacturing jobs next month. It is half full because this might finally show Democrat union members that voting for Democrats will ultimately vote them out of a job.
Dan Adams.
Well, my glass is half full because some in government are figuring out that releasing criminal offenders into the community with job skills, not social work skills, is good for public safety. We're seeing Correctional Institute recently started a CNC machining course, and the Milwaukee House of Corrections is also instituting job skills program. My glass is half empty because many employers won't consider hiring someone with a criminal record. I hope as the job market improves, so will prospects for those who are trying to turn their lives around.
Brian Sikma.
Well, my glass is half empty this week as Russia establishes a client state in Syria, bolstering the Assad regime with warplanes and ground forces. My glass is half full because Russia's economy is struggling and it is facing a demographic winter. Its military intervention is not a move of strength, but a desperate, if destabilizing, attempt at grandeur.
Well, my glass is half full because the unemployment rate stayed at 5.1% last Friday. It's half empty because a record 94.6 million Americans are out of the workforce altogether. And the labor participation rate is the lowest it has been since Jimmy Carter was president. Next on Sunday Insight, local jobs are leaving. What is going on? Bad news on the local job front. Joy Global announces the layoff of more than 100 union employees, while GE says it will cut 350 jobs in Waukesha and move them to Canada. GE blamed Congress for failing to renew the so-called Export-Import Bank, which critics has described as corporate welfare and an example of corporate cronyism. One local legislator was not buying GE's explanation. Republican State Representative Scott Allen, who pointed out that GE says the decision was made a long time ago and was irreversible. So your take on this, Brian Sikma, did the failure of Congress to renew the Export-Import Bank, did it cause these job losses in Waukesha?
No, and General Electric is lying because they don't want to explain their business model. And that's fine. companies don't have to explain their business model, but the fact is GE is realigning globally. They're moving jobs all around. You know, last year they said they were moving jobs to France. Well, this year they announced that those jobs they're moving to France are a result of the Export-Import Bank expiring. And Congressman Paul Ryan and Senator Ron Johnson have it right when they say, look, we don't need to reauthorize this Export-Import Bank because it's really a taxpayer giveaway to large corporations like GE, which can afford to actually underwrite their own finances and their own sales.
Yeah, now the way the Export-Import Bank operates basically is it lends money to foreign entities, foreign countries, so that they can then buy American products. But almost all of the money goes to three companies. 87% goes to GE, Caterpillar, and Boeing. So do you think the failure to renew this bank, these particular handouts, is the reason those jobs are leaving?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is absolutely a scandal, and Brian wrote a really nice story about it this week, and frankly, Representative Allen deserves a merit badge for being a whistleblower on this. This plant makes engines that are used for the extraction of oil, mostly in North America, and as the Saudis have flooded the market with cheap oil, there just isn't demand for these machines. That's that is the market reason why GE is shuttering this plant and consolidating in Canada, and for them to try to bully politicians is wrong.
Well, but it works, though. I mean, there really is. I mean, the corporate welfare world works. You know, you get billionaire companies or billionaire owners of basketball teams, for example, who basically threaten that we don't need the money, but if you don't give us this, we're going to take our job someplace else. And generally, the politicians cave in, don't they?
They usually do, and they shouldn't. They need to stop, so I'm glad that they did stop. Obviously, the reason that they're leaving is not because that wasn't renewed. But I have to say, I don't think Scott Allen did the right thing by writing that letter. GE employs thousands of people in the state of Wisconsin. I mean, it was good that he called them out, but at the same time, I don't think we want to be dissing a large employer in the state.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was going to say that as well. This is a very, very small percentage of GE employees in the state of Wisconsin. You know, what's really interesting is I read an article in Time magazine that the Koch brothers, Koch brothers, are opposed to this corporate welfare. Yeah. But I think the solution would be if Scott Walker was able to put up that wall around Canada, then nobody can send the jobs over there.
I think they did that in South Park. What I think is, you know, we are focused on this, but I think the irony, of course, is the EPA came down with these new ozone rules that Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce will say will ultimately kill 23,000 jobs in this state. We are still a very heavily manufacturing state, and the Obama administration continues to come down with these new ozone clean power plans. They're going to have a devastating impact on manufacturing. You're also seeing the Joy Global layoffs, in part because of mining. That's a result, if people would begin to connect the dots, to what's happening with the war on coal mining. Now, you may not want to hear it, but we'll tell you anyway. Let's hand out some unsolicited advice. Michael Holt, you're first.
Well, mine is to Caitlyn Jenner, who wasn't charged for an auto accident that killed another female. Be glad you aren't RuPaul. You would have been put under the jail.
Ooh, Michelle Litjens.
To all of our schools and colleges, allow people to carry weapons onto campus. All of these shooting massacres happen where guns are prohibited, so people are sitting ducks.
Dan Adams.
Well, my advice is to Governor Scott Walker. There is a vacancy in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Think about filling it with someone who has paid their dues, has extensive judicial experience, and will serve as a placeholder until the April election.
Brian Sikma.
Well, my unsolicited advice is for the cabal of left-wing groups that told Governor Scott Walker this week whom he shouldn't appoint to the vacancy on the Supreme Court. Hey, folks, you can't complain he's not doing enough while he runs for president and then tell him to not do his job when he returns.
There's going to be a theme here. My unsolicited advice is also to Governor Scott Walker. Liberal activist groups, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel editorial board, and Dan Adams, but I repeat myself, are telling you not to appoint conservative Judge Rebecca Bradley to a vacant seat on the state Supreme Court. Ignore them all. Next on Sunday Insight, can the Government Accountability Board be reformed before the next election? The state legislature is moving ahead with sweeping reforms to the state's Government Accountability Board. Republicans have long accused the GAB of incompetence and partisan bias, citing its role in the now defunct John Doe probe targeting conservatives. Under the new plan, the GAB would be broken into two bodies, a new Ethics and Election Commission comprised of 6 appointments to each board. Last week, the chairman of the current Government Accountability Board, Gerald Nichols, asked legislators to delay major changes, saying that change would be too disruptive because there's a major election coming up next year. Your reaction, Dan Adams?
Yeah, I think with any government program, you have to ask, what is this here for? What is the actual purpose? Yeah. And for the GAB, it should be transparency, so we know who's taking money from who's lobbying who, and then the ability to give guidance to candidates and committees so that they don't break the law. They shouldn't be some type of watchdog. I mean, if it's really a bad thing, the DAs and the AG will go after it. If it's not a too bad thing, the electorate and other politicians will expose it.
Well, Mikel Holt, I thought it was interesting. You said, "Well, there's a big election coming up next year," but there's always a big election coming up. I mean, if it's not next year's election, it will be the 2018 election. And people say, "Well, we have a governor's election up in 2018." Yeah. So I
disagree with Dan on one point. I think they should be a watchdog. Yeah. I think they should look into any possibilities of fraud. You know, Wisconsin has a fraud problem. That's why they have voter ID, right? But I mean, they should look into whether candidates are truly, pass all the little tests. They have let people through who've turned in short records. I mean, turned in small amount of candidates.
They've just done a bad job. And I think at minimum, don't you want to have both political parties believe that the quote-unquote watchdog or whatever function
So it's going to be 3 and 3? When they appoint 6 people, it's going to be 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans?
That, I believe, is the idea. And I think that at minimum, you'd want to have both political parties believe that they have some credibility. And what happened, I think, was under Kevin Kennedy, is that became partisan, and Republicans have a long list of things they will say. They believe that they acted unfairly. Their role in the John Doe investigation, I think, has discredited them. And at minimum, shouldn't both political parties have confidence that the judges are not biased?
Most definitely, this reform needs to happen now. They will have a contingency plan to make sure that we can smoothly go into the next election cycle. I am sure some of the same employees are going to continue to work there. So,
well, the status quo is always going to say it's a bad time to change the status quo. But we know the status quo is broken. I mean, the GAB has a secretive black budget that they're accountable to no one for, that they're able to spend in these investigations. The GAB even said that if Mickey Mouse signed a recall petition, they weren't going to challenge that. They were going to wait for someone else to do it. They scheduled recall elections in legislative districts that no longer existed under the law. I mean, the GAB has a long history of abusing its authority, so something needs to change.
Well, something is going to change, because 2 years ago, interesting an anniversary, 2 years ago, yesterday morning, you had armed agents of the John Doe investigation, of John Chisholm and of the Government Accountability Board, staged those paramilitary pre-dawn raids of conservatives. That John Doe probe has now been thrown out. It was thrown out by the John Doe judge. It was thrown out by a federal judge. And then, of course, the state Supreme Court ruled that essentially they had made up the law as they went on and completely exonerated the targets. If that is not a roadmap for why you need to dismantle this particular rogue agency, I don't know what would be. And I actually think that the argument that there's a big election coming up next year is all the more reason why you want to fix it. So what is it you don't get? Let's go around the table. Mikel Holt, you're first.
What I don't get is where presidential candidate Donald Trump found a survey that said he would get 25% of the black vote. I think he misread it. It probably revealed 25 blind, deaf, and dumb black people might vote for him.
Michelle Litjens.
Charlie, I don't understand why American soldiers are expected to stand by and watch some Afghan men rape children because it's some kind of cultural tradition. Weren't our soldiers sent there to stop these atrocities?
Dan Adams.
I just don't get the attraction of FanDuel and DraftKings, which are dominating the NFL's advertisements, offering a new form of online gambling.
Money.
I guess a new way to separate people from their money is invented every day.
Brian Sikma.
What I don't get is why, with a record number of 94.6 million Americans not even in the workforce, the Obama administration insists on imposing new EPA regulations that will cost even more Americans their jobs.
Well, what I don't get, President Obama says we should all be more outraged by gun violence, but through September, there have been more than 2,300 shootings in Chicago, which is Obama's hometown. But we haven't heard him say a peep about that. Could it be because Chicago has some of the tightest gun control laws in the country, and they don't work? Next on Sunday Inside, our panel picks the winners and losers of the week. But first, here's your morning news update. It's time for our panel to pick the winners and losers of the week. Mikel Holt, you're first.
Well, my loser, Scott Walker, the lowest approval ratings of his political career, a week after dropping out of the presidential race. Welcome back. Winner, it could be Scott Walker if he appointed Joe Donald to the Supreme Court to replace deceased Justice Patrick Crooks.
Yeah, that could happen. Michelle Litjens.
My losers are the residents of Chicago, where they are now paying a 9% cloud tax. Yes, they are paying a tax to watch Netflix. My winner is Congressman Paul Ryan for deciding not to run for Speaker, even though he would have done a fantastic job. Ryan wants to prepare real tax and entitlement reform so that when a Republican wins the White House, the reform packages are ready to go.
Dan Adams.
My winner, and probably, is Hillary Clinton. Her poll numbers aren't great, but they're okay. Joe Biden is less likely to jump into the race by the day, and Bernie Sanders is simply not a serious opponent. My loser, the GOP's next probable Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, who let the mask slip this week, bragging that the Benghazi investigation is a political machination intended to take Hillary Clinton down. If anything, this will unify Democrats around Clinton.
Brian Sikma.
Well, my winner this week is Chris Mintz, an Army veteran, dad, and student at Umpqua Community College in Oregon. When a gunman went on a rampage this week at the gun-free campus, Chris sprang into action and assaulted the shooter despite being shot at least 7 times. His heroism and decision to act instead of become a victim are an inspiration and lesson to us all. My loser of the week is Wisconsin's minimum markup law. Multiple times since the law was enacted in 1939, Democrats have suggested it should be repealed. As competitors use the law to attack a new grocery store chain that's moving into Wisconsin, it's time for the law to go.
Well, my winner, NASA, which found water on Mars, signs there may be life on that planet. Now, if we could just find some signs of intelligent life in Congress, please. Thanks for joining us today for my radio show Monday morning. It's on News Radio 620 WTMJ from 8:30 until noon. Have a great week.